The Nanny's Revenge. The announcement echoed through Gate 23 at LaGuardia Airport. Now boarding Flight 447 to Miami. First-class passengers, please proceed to the gate. Margaret Washington, 70 years old, stood up slowly from her seat in the crowded waiting area. Her knees protested. Arthritis. 50 years of standing, cooking, cleaning, raising other people's children. She wore a simple floral dress, comfortable shoes, and carried a worn vinyl handbag that had seen better days. Beside her stood the Thornton family. Richard Thornton, 52, wore a Tom Ford suit that cost more than Margaret's monthly Social Security check. His wife, Clarissa, 48, was draped in Chanel, her face frozen in a permanent expression of mild disgust. Their daughter, Brittany, 24, was glued to her phone, filming herself for Instagram. "Margaret, grab my carry-on," Clarissa commanded without looking up from her phone. "And Richard's briefcase. They're too heavy for me." Margaret reached for the Louis Vuitton bag. It weighed almost nothing. "Of course, Mrs. Thornton," Margaret said quietly. Richard handed her his briefcase without a word, like she was a coat rack, invisible. They walked to the gate. The Thorntons presented their first-class boarding passes. The gate agent smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton. Enjoy your flight." Margaret stepped forward with her own boarding pass. The agent's smile flickered. "Ma'am, are you traveling with the Thorntons?" "Yes," Margaret said. "She's our help," Clarissa said loudly, as if Margaret couldn't speak for herself. "She's been with us for 3 months. We're taking her to Miami because we need someone to watch the beach house while we're at the yacht club." The gate agent's expression shifted, pity mixed with discomfort. Margaret said nothing. She'd heard worse in 70 years. They boarded the plane. First class was elegant. Spacious leather seats, warm lighting, the scent of fresh coffee. The Thorntons settled into seats 1A, 1B, and 2A. A perfect little pod of privilege. Margaret stood in the aisle, holding their bags. "Margaret, put those in the overhead," Richard said, not looking at her. He was already on his laptop. Margaret lifted the heavy bags. Her shoulders screamed, but she didn't complain. The flight attendant, a kind-looking woman named Dana, approached. "Ma'am, can I help you with that?" "She's got it," Clarissa snapped. "That's what we pay her for." Dana's smile tightened. She stepped back. Margaret finally sat down in seat 3C. Across the aisle, close enough to be summoned, far enough to be ignored. The plane filled up. Business travelers, families, a few tourists, and then, in seat 2C, right next to Margaret, a man in his 60s sat down. He was black, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and kind eyes. He wore a simple blazer and carried a leather briefcase. He smiled at Margaret. "Good morning." "Good morning," Margaret replied softly. The man extended his hand. James Patterson." Margaret shook it. "Margaret Washington." "Pleasure to meet you, Margaret." James settled into his seat. "Heading to Miami for business or pleasure?" "Work, I suppose," Margaret said. "I'm traveling with a family I work for." James nodded. "Caretaker." "Something like that." The plane took off smoothly. The Thorntons immediately ordered champagne. Brittany started filming herself, holding up the glass, talking about living my best life at 30,000. Margaret stared out the window. James pulled out a book, a legal thriller. 20 minutes into the flight, Clarissa's voice rang out like a bell. "Margaret!" Margaret turned. "Yes, Mrs. Thornton. I need my neck pillow. It's in my bag." "Get it." Margaret unbuckled, stood, opened the overhead bin, and retrieved the pillow. She handed it to Clarissa. "No, thank you. Not even eye contact." Margaret sat back down. James looked over, his face unreadable. 30 minutes later, Richard called out, "Margaret, I'm hungry. Tell the attendant I want the salmon, not the chicken. Make sure they know I'm allergic to cilantro." Margaret stood again, walking to the galley. Dana, the flight attendant, was preparing meals. "Excuse me," Margaret said politely. "Mr. Thornton would like the salmon. He's allergic to cilantro." Dana smiled. "Of course. I'll make a note." Margaret returned to her seat. James was watching her, not with pity, with something else. Recognition. You've been doing this a long time, he said quietly. 50 years, Margaret admitted. 50 years, James repeated. He shook his head slowly. That's a lifetime of service. It's honest work, Margaret said. It is, James agreed. But honesty deserves respect. Margaret didn't respond. She'd given up on respect a long time ago. An hour into the flight, Brittany dropped her phone in the aisle. Margaret, pick that up. Margaret bent down, her back protesting. She handed the phone to Brittany. Brittany didn't even look at her. God, this flight is so long. Why doesn't Dad just buy a private jet? Clarissa laughed. Because your father is cheap. Richard didn't respond. He was on a work call, talking loudly about quarterly earnings. James leaned over to Margaret. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you stay? Margaret looked at him. Really looked at him. His eyes were warm, genuine. I need the money, she said simply. Social Security doesn't cover much. And at 70, nobody else will hire me. James nodded slowly. I understand. The flight attendant, Dana, approached with meals. She served the Thorntons first. Salmon for Richard. Chicken for Clarissa. A salad for Brittany, who immediately complained it had too much dressing. Then Dana turned to Margaret. And for you, ma'am. Before Margaret could answer, Clarissa's voice cut through the cabin. She doesn't need a first-class meal, just give her some crackers or something. We're not paying for her to eat like us. The entire first-class cabin went silent. Dana's face flushed with anger. Ma'am, every passenger in this cabin receives the same meal service. Well, she's not really a passenger, Clarissa said, waving her hand dismissively. She's staff. There's a difference. Margaret felt the familiar burn of humiliation. She looked down at her lap, and then James spoke. His voice was calm, quiet, but it carried the weight of a gavel. Mrs. Thornton, is it? Clarissa turned, annoyed. Yes. And you are? I'm James Patterson, he said. And I'm curious. What makes you think you have the authority to decide who deserves a meal on this aircraft? Clarissa blinked. Excuse me, you heard me. James's tone didn't change. Still calm, still polite, but there was steel underneath. This woman has a ticket. She's a paying passenger. You don't get to decide her worth. Richard looked up from his laptop, irritated. Listen, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but we're having a private conversation with our employee. Your employee? James raised an eyebrow. She's sitting in a passenger seat, not serving you from a galley. So unless you've chartered this plane, she's a passenger. Just like you. Brittany looked up from her phone, finally interested. Who is this guy? Clarissa's face turned red. This is none of your business. Actually, James said, leaning back in his seat, it became my business when you decided to humiliate someone in public. I have a low tolerance for that. Are you threatening me? Richard stood up, puffing out his chest. Threatening? James smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. No, just observe. Dana, the flight attendant, stepped in. Gentlemen, ladies, please, let's all take a breath. She placed a meal tray in front of Margaret. Here you go, ma'am. Salmon, just like you deserve. Margaret looked at the tray, then at James, then at Dana. Her eyes were wet. Thank you, she whispered. The Thorntons glared at James, but said nothing more. The flight continued in tense silence. 2 hours later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Miami. Weather is clear. Temperature is 85 degrees. We'll be on the ground in about 20 minutes. The Thorntons started gathering their things. Clarissa handed Margaret a pile of trash. Napkins, empty champagne bottles, magazine. Throw this away, Clarissa ordered. Margaret stood, taking the trash to the galley. When she returned, James was standing in the aisle, stretching. Margaret, he said, do you have a card? A phone number? Margaret looked confused. A card? No, I don't have anything like that. James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card. He handed it to her. Margaret looked at it. Her eyes widened. James Patterson, United States District Court Judge, Southern District of Florida. Margaret's hand trembled. You're a judge? I am, James said. And if you ever need legal help, you call me. Understand? Margaret nodded, speechless. The plane landed smoothly. Passengers began deplaning. The Thorntons pushed past everyone, dragging Margaret behind them like luggage. At the baggage claim, Richard grabbed Margaret's arm. "Get our bags. And hurry up. The car is waiting." Margaret moved to the carousel, scanning for their designer luggage. Behind her, she heard a voice. "Richard Thornton." Richard turned. A man in a suit was standing there, holding a folder. "Yes, you've been served." The man handed Richard a thick envelope. "Civil lawsuit, wrongful termination and wage theft. Catherine Morrison versus Thornton Properties." Richard's face went white. "What?" "Catherine, our old housekeeper." "That's correct. She's suing for unpaid wages, overtime violations, and emotional distress. Court date is in 3 weeks." The process server walked away. Clarissa grabbed the envelope, ripping it open. "This is insane. We paid her. Did you?" James's voice came from behind them. The Thorntons spun around. James was standing there, briefcase in hand, smiling. "Judge Patterson," Richard stammered. "What are you doing here?" "I live in Miami," James said. "And I'm very interested in labor law, especially cases involving domestic workers who are exploited, underpaid, and treated like property." Clarissa's face turned bright red. "You set this up." "I didn't set anything up," James said calmly. "But Catherine Morrison's lawyer is a colleague of mine, and when he told me about your case, I offered to help. Pro bono." Richard stepped forward. "You can't do this. This is harassment." "Harassment?" James laughed. "No, Mr. Thornton. This is justice. See, Margaret here told me she's been with you for 3 months, and I'm willing to bet you haven't paid her overtime, haven't given her breaks, haven't treated her like a human being." Margaret stood frozen, holding their luggage. James turned to her. "Margaret, have they paid you for overtime? For the 16-hour days? For working weekends?" Margaret looked at the Thorntons, then at James. "No," she said quietly. "They pay me $200 a week, cash. No contract." James nodded. $200 a week. For 70 hours of work. That's less than $3 an hour. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. Richard's lawyer face activated. "You can't prove any of this." "Can't I?" James pulled out his phone. "Margaret, did you ever text Mrs. Thornton about your hours?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes. She told me to text her every morning when I arrived and every night when I left." "Do you still have those texts?" Margaret pulled out her old flip phone. She scrolled through. Hundreds of messages. Timestamps. Date. James smiled. "That's evidence." Clarissa grabbed Margaret's arm. "You're fired. Right now. Get out." "Perfect," James said. "Now we can add retaliation to the lawsuit." Brittany finally looked up from her phone. "Dad, what's happening?" "What's happening," James said, "is your parents are about to learn a very expensive lesson about treating people with dignity." He turned to Margaret. "You don't have to work for them anymore. I'm going to connect you with a lawyer. A good one. You're going to sue them for every penny you're owed. Plus damages." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "But I need the money. I can't afford to wait for a lawsuit." "You won't have to wait," James said. "I'm also going to connect you with a domestic workers' rights organization. They'll help you find new work. Real work. With real pay and real respect." He looked at the Thorntons. "And you 3, you're going to settle. Fast. Because if this goes to court, I'm going to make sure every news outlet in Florida knows how you treat your employee." Richard's face was purple with rage. "You can't do this." "I already did," James said. He turned and walked away, leaving the Thorntons standing in stunned silence. Margaret stood there, holding the business card, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in 50 years, someone had stood up for her. 3 months later, Margaret Washington sat in a clean, bright office in downtown Miami. Across from her sat attorney Rachel Gomez, one of the best labor lawyers in the state. "The settlement offer just came in," Rachel said, sliding a paper across the desk. Margaret read the number. Her hands shook. "They're settling," Margaret whispered. "They don't have a choice," Rachel said. "Judge Patterson personally called their lawyer. Told them if this went to trial, he'd make sure it became a class action. Every domestic worker they'd ever employed would come forward. Margaret looked at the paper. A lifetime of disrespect. A lifetime of being invisible. And now, justice. There's more, Rachel said. She pulled out another document. The Thorntons have also been fined by the Department of Labor. $25,000. And they're under investigation for tax fraud. Turns out, paying employees under the table is illegal. Margaret laughed. A real laugh. The first one in years. What will you do with the money? Rachel asked. Margaret thought for a moment. I'm going to retire. For real this time. Maybe travel. Maybe just rest. You deserve it, Rachel said. Margaret stood, shaking Rachel's hand. Thank you, and thank Judge Patterson. You can thank him yourself, Rachel said. He's waiting outside. Margaret walked into the hallway. James was sitting there, reading a newspaper. He looked up and smiled. Margaret, Judge Patterson. Margaret sat down next to him. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me, James said. You just have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll never let anyone treat you like that again. You have worth, Margaret. You always did. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. James handed her a tissue. Now go. Enjoy your retirement. You earned it. Margaret stood, walking toward the exit. But she stopped and turned back. Judge Patterson? Yes. Why did you help me? James smiled. Because my mother was a domestic worker. For 40 years, she cleaned houses, raised other people's children, and was treated like she was invisible. She died without ever seeing justice. He stood. I couldn't help her, but I could help you. Margaret walked over and hugged him. Thank you. As she walked out into the Miami sunshine, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Freedom. 1 year later, the Thornton family's world had completely collapsed. Richard's real estate empire crumbled after the labor investigation revealed years of wage theft across his properties. He was forced to sell his mansion, his yacht, and his vacation homes to pay settlements and fines. Clarissa's social standing evaporated. The country club revoked her membership. Her friends stopped returning her calls. Brittany's Instagram following dropped from 2 million to 30,000 after she posted a tone-deaf video complaining about cancel culture. They lost everything because they forgot one simple truth. Everyone deserves respect. Margaret, meanwhile, bought a small cottage in the Florida Keys. She spent her days reading, gardening, and volunteering at a local domestic workers advocacy center. She helped other women like her, women who had been invisible for too long. And every month, she had lunch with Judge James Patterson. They became friends. Real friends. On the anniversary of their plane ride, they met at a seaside restaurant. James raised his glass. To justice, Margaret smiled. To dignity, they clinked glasses, watching the sun set over the ocean. Somewhere in Miami, the Thorntons were filing for bankruptcy. But Margaret wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about the future. Her future. And for the first time in 70 years, it looked bright.